Not long ago, a listener named Isabel wrote to me from Colombia. She told me that what she is about to share happened when she was 28 years old, and that she never sought to be believed. She just needed someone else to know. If you also carry something that you haven't been able to tell anyone, the comments are there. But first, let me tell you what happened to Isabel the night she found the mirror. I was never one to believe in these things. I say this because it matters. Because the kind of person I was before that night is part of the story. I was the type who, when someone shared a paranormal experience at a gathering, would nod politely, but inside I was searching for a logical explanation. Psychology, suggestibility, lack of sleep, the brain filling gaps with what it fears. I had an answer for everything. I was 28 years old. I worked as an administrator in a logistics company, lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 5th floor of a building that had the neutral charm of 1990s architecture. Everything in my life was orderly, predictable, and completely mine. I liked it that way. The mirror came into my life because of a move. My neighbor from the 4th floor, a lady named Hortensia, whom I greeted in the elevator, but with whom I had never had a long conversation, knocked on my door one Saturday morning with an expression of preemptive apology. "Isabel, I need a favor," she said. "I'm moving next week and I have some things I can't take with me. If you want something, I'll give it to you. If not, I'll take it down to the street." I accompanied her to her apartment out of curiosity more than necessity. She had everything I needed. Hortensia's apartment was already half empty, with stacked boxes and that atmosphere of desolation that spaces have when the objects that inhabited them begin to disappear. In the hallway, leaning against the wall, there was a mirror. It was large, almost 2 meters tall, with a dark wooden frame carved with a design I couldn't identify. Intertwined figures that could be flowers or could be something else, depending on the angle from which you looked. The glass was old, with that slight distortion characteristic of old mirrors that makes the reflection look slightly different from that of a modern mirror. "Where did you get it?" I asked Hortensia. "I bought it at an antique fair years ago," she said. "I never knew exactly how old it is. The seller said it was from the last century, but those sellers say anything. Why don't you take it with you?" Hortensia paused briefly. "It doesn't fit in the new place," she said. "And to be honest, I never really liked it. There's something about it that I can't explain. That should have been enough warning. Instead, I looked in the mirror and thought it would look perfect in the second room of my apartment, the one I used as a studio. I brought it up that same afternoon with the help of the doorman. I leaned it against the back wall of the studio in front of the desk and looked at it from the door. It looked good. It added depth to the room, that effect that large mirrors have of making a space seem larger. I thought it was a fortunate acquisition. That night, nothing happened. Neither the next one, nor the one that followed it. For almost 2 weeks the mirror was there and I ignored it with the indifference one has towards decorative objects that have already integrated into the space. I would catch a glimpse of it out of the corner of my eye when passing through the study, nothing more. It was in the 3rd week when I noticed the first thing. I was working from home some days, and that Thursday I was in the study with the laptop open, reviewing reports. At some point, I lifted my eyes from the screen, as one does mechanically after staring at text for a long time, and looked at the mirror. My reflection met my gaze, which is completely normal. That's what mirrors do, except that my reflection took a second longer than it should have to make the same movement I did. It was so small, so brief, that I dismissed it immediately. A fraction of a second. The kind of optical illusion that fatigue or distraction produces. I continued with the report and didn't think about it anymore. But the next day it happened again. This time I saw it more clearly. I lifted my gaze to the mirror, and my reflection, my image in the old glass, took a noticeable moment before looking up as well. Not much, not enough for anyone else to have certainly noticed. But I saw it. I got up from the chair and stood in front of the mirror. I moved. I raised my right arm. The reflection raised it at the same time, exactly synchronized. I turned my head, synchronized. I smiled, synchronized. I stared at my own image for a moment, looking for any sign of desynchronization. There was none. The reflection was perfect, timely, exact. I decided it had been my imagination and went back to work. That night, before going to bed, I passed by the study to turn off the light I had left on. From the door, without entering, I looked at the mirror. The room was dark except for the light from the hallway coming in where I was standing. The mirror reflected the room, the desk, the window with the blinds closed, and in the center, my figure outlined against the light from the hallway. I turned off the light and closed the door. But just before the door finished closing, in the last moment I had vision of the mirror. I saw that my reflection did not move when I moved. I stood still in the hallway with my hand on the handle of the closed door. My heart was beating faster than normal. I suddenly opened the door and turned on the light. The mirror reflected me entering the room, turning on the light, looking at it. Everything synchronized. Everything normal. I stood in front of it for several minutes, moving in different ways, looking for any discrepancies. There were none. I went to sleep telling myself it was lack of sleep, that I had been working too much for weeks, that the human eye is notoriously unreliable when tired. I believed it enough to sleep. I called my friend Carmen the next day, not to tell her about the mirror, at least not directly. I asked her, with as much naturalness as I could, if she knew anything about antique mirrors, and if it was true that old glass sometimes produced distortions in the reflection. Carmen is an interior designer and knows about these things. The mirrors with antique glass can indeed have imperfections, she said. The mercury they used before as backing deteriorates over time and creates areas where reflectivity is not uniform. It can produce strange visual effects, like a delay in movement. Carmen paused. What kind of delay? As if the reflection took a little longer to make the same movement. Another silence. That's not an imperfection of the glass, Isabel, she said. It doesn't work that way. I know, I said. It was just a theoretical question. Carmen didn't respond immediately. Do you want me to go see that mirror? No, I said. It's nothing, thank you. I hung up and sat in the living room looking at the closed door of the studio. That afternoon, I entered the studio intending to keep working and to ignore the mirror with the determination of someone who has decided not to feed an illusion. I sat at the desk, opened the laptop, and worked for almost an hour without looking in the mirror even once. It was the concentration that made me let my guard down. When one truly works, absorbed in something, the awareness of the surroundings fades away. You spend 40 minutes reading a document and suddenly look up for no particular reason and find yourself staring at something you weren't expecting to see. I lifted my eyes from the screen and looked at the mirror. In the reflection, the room was the same. The desk, the lamp, the window with the blinds half open, me sitting in front of the laptop. But in the reflection, the study door was open. The real door, the one behind me, I had closed when I entered. I remembered it clearly because I always do it, out of habit. I turned to check. The door was closed. I turned back to the mirror. In the reflection, the door was still open. And in the frame of that reflected door, there was a figure. It was not a clear figure. It was more like a density in the darkness of the reflected hallway, an area where the shadow had more presence than the rest, with a shape that was vaguely that of something upright. I couldn't see details. It was just a dark shape in a threshold that in reality was closed. I turned again towards the real door. Closed. The hallway on the other side silent. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was no longer there. The reflected door remained open, but the doorway was empty. I got up from the chair, took the mirror by the frame, and turned it to face the wall. I slept with the hallway light on that night. The next morning, I called Hortensia. It took me a moment to get her number, which I had saved on my phone when we crossed paths and had never used beyond the occasional building message. I dialed several times before she answered. I told her what I had seen. I did it with as much objectivity as I could, describing it as if it were a technical phenomenon that I wanted her to explain to me. Hortensia listened in silence. When I finished, there was a long pause. "Isabel," she finally said, "there's a reason I didn't take that mirror. You told me it didn't fit in the new place. I lied to you, or at least I didn't tell you everything. The truth is that I bought that mirror without knowing what I was buying, and when I started to understand that something was wrong with it, I already had it in my house. I kept it because I didn't know what to do with it, and because as long as I didn't use it directly, as long as I kept it covered, it seemed harmless." "Covered?" "I always had it with a cloth over it," Hortensia said. "In my apartment. What I didn't tell you when I offered it to you is that the cloth should have stayed." "What is that mirror, Hortensia?" Another pause. "The seller at the fair told me something when I bought it, that at the time seemed just like a sales pitch. That the mirror had belonged to a family that used it for certain practices. That the glass had been prepared in a particular way. I didn't understand well what he meant until I started to notice things." What things? The same ones you describe, he said. The reflection that doesn't synchronize. The differences between what is in the room and what the glass shows. And once, just once, I saw something in it that wasn't me. What did you see? Hortensia took a while to respond. I saw my mother, she said. My mother died 12 years ago. I saw her in the mirror, standing behind me, looking at me. When I turned around, there was no one. When I looked back at the mirror, she was still there. And she was looking at me with an expression that my mother never had in life. That didn't correspond to her. The silence that followed was long. Cover it up, Hortensia finally said. Cover it up and take it out of the apartment. Don't give it away, don't sell it. Throw it away. Why didn't you tell me this before giving it to me? Because I hoped nothing would happen, she said. Because with you, I had only lived 4 years in the same building without anything ever happening. I thought maybe it was something personal, something related to me specifically. I was wrong. I'm sorry, Isabel. I hung up the phone and went straight to the studio. The mirror was turned towards the wall, just as I had left it the night before. I left it that way. I searched for a sheet in the hallway closet, the thickest one I had, and covered the mirror with it, making sure that no part of the glass was exposed. Then I sat in the living room and spent a long time doing nothing, processing. What Hortensia had described, what I had seen, had no place in the version of reality I had built in 28 years of rational and skeptical life. And yet it was there, concrete and impossible to ignore. That night I slept in the living room, on the sofa, with all the lights on. I didn't sleep well, but I slept, and nothing happened. The next day I asked the doorman for help to take the mirror down to the building's basement, which was where things that neighbors were going to discard were left. The doorman was named Mr. Armando, and he was an older man who didn't ask unnecessary questions, a quality I deeply appreciated at that moment. We took the mirror down covered with the sheet. Mr. Armando placed it against the basement wall without saying a word. Mr. Armando, I said to him before going back up, that mirror is going to the trash. If the large furniture collection truck comes, let them take it. Understood, he said. I went up to the apartment and closed the door. During the following days I was waiting for something. I didn't know exactly what. Some continuation of what had begun, some sign that taking the mirror out of the study hadn't been enough. I checked the corners of the rooms without really knowing what I was looking for. I avoided looking at the other mirrors in the apartment, the one in the bathroom and the small one in the hallway, for longer than necessary. Nothing happened. A week later, the truck came and took everything that was in the basement. Don Armando confirmed it to me when I ran into him in the elevator. I slept well that night for the first time since the mirror had arrived in my apartment. But this is where the story gets complicated. 3 weeks later, Carmen came to visit me. We had coffee in the living room, and at some point, she went to the bathroom. She took longer than she normally did. When she came out, her expression was different. Isabel, she said, how long has that mirror been in your bathroom? It's always been there, I said. I bought it when I moved in. Have you checked it lately? Checked it how? Carmen looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Go look at yourself in it, she said. I went to the bathroom. I stood in front of the small mirror above the sink. I looked at myself. My reflection looked back at me. What am I supposed to see? I yelled to Carmen from the bathroom. Stay still for a moment, she said from the living room. I stayed still. I looked at myself. The reflection, still too. Everything normal. Then, without me doing anything, my reflection smiled. Just for a moment. A brief curvature of the lips that did not correspond to any movement I had made. So fast that if Carmen hadn't prepared me to be attentive, if I hadn't been looking with that specific concentration, I wouldn't have seen her. I left the bathroom. Did you see it? Carmen asked. Yes, I said. Carmen had the phone in her hand. I have a friend who knows about these things, she said. I'll call her now. Carmen's friend's name was Lucia. She came that same afternoon, a woman in her 50s, discreet, with a way of moving around the apartment that reminded me of someone reading something that others couldn't see. She entered the bathroom, stood in front of the mirror for a while, and came out without saying anything yet. She went to each room, to the study where the large mirror was no longer there, but where Lucia paused for a moment in the spot where it had been leaning against the wall, to the kitchen, to the hallway. Finally, she sat in the living room with Carmen and me. The large mirror you took, she said, had been here long enough to leave something. Not the object itself, but what the object had been accumulating. that doesn't always go away with the object. What do you mean it stays? I asked. That the bathroom mirror started to absorb something that wasn't its own, Lucia said. Mirrors are permeable in a way that isn't well understood. The antique mirror you had here had decades of accumulation. Part of that migrated. And what's in the bathroom mirror now? Lucia looked directly at me. Something that learned to imitate, she said. It's not the same entity that was in the large mirror, if there was anything with that definition in the large mirror. It's more like an echo, an imperfect copy that learned a behavior. What behavior? Looking at you, she said. Studying you. Mirrors that work like this first learn to observe and then to reproduce. What you saw, that smile, was a reproduction. Something it saw in you and repeated at the wrong moment. I stayed silent, processing that. How is it resolved? Lucia and Carmen exchanged a glance. The bathroom mirror has to be thrown away, Lucia said. And the apartment needs to be cleaned, especially the study. It's nothing complicated, but it has to be done with intention, with a clear awareness of what is being done and why. We did it that afternoon. Lucia was the one who brought the plants we needed, the incense, the salt water. I followed her through each room of the apartment, paying attention to her instructions, doing what she asked. The bathroom mirror ended up in the street container before it got dark. When Lucia and Carmen left, the apartment felt different, not in a dramatic way. There was no obvious transformation. It was more subtle than that. It was the difference between the air of a room that has been closed for a long time and the air of the same room when you open the windows. The same room, but the weight of the atmosphere lightened. I bought a new mirror for the bathroom, a small modern one, made of glass with no history. I installed it myself and looked at it for a long minute before deciding it was just a mirror. That was 2 years ago. I haven't seen anything in any reflection that wasn't exactly what it was supposed to be. I haven't felt that sense of dissonance again, that fraction of a second more before the reflection responds. What has changed, and this is what I don't know how to explain entirely, is my relationship with mirrors. I'm not exactly afraid of them, but I no longer treat them with the automatic indifference I had before. I look at them with an attention that didn't exist in me until that year. I look at them and sometimes I wonder what exactly a mirror does when no one is looking at it. I still don't have an answer for that, and I think I prefer not to find it. End of Isabel's testimony. She authorized me to share her story in the hope that if someone else has noticed something strange in an old mirror, they know they are not imagining things. If something similar has ever happened to you, or if you have an object in your house with a story you don't quite understand, tell me in the comments. I'm interested in reading it. And if this story accompanied you tonight, subscribe. There are many more waiting. Sleep well. We'll hear from each other soon. This experience was shared with me by Laura, a primary school teacher, who inherited her great-grandmother's house in a rural town in Chiapas. What she found hidden in the walls made her discover a family secret that had been hidden for generations. If you have inherited something that perhaps you shouldn't have received, tell me in the comments. Now let me take you to the story of Laura and the mirror that should never have been opened. My name is Laura, and I am a primary school teacher in Mexico City. I am 32 years old, live alone, and until a year ago, my life was completely normal and predictable. That changed when I received a call from a notary in Chiapas, informing me that my great-grandmother Celestina had passed away at the age of 98, leaving me her house as an inheritance. I barely remembered my great-grandmother. I had only seen her twice in my childhood, during brief family visits to her village. She lived in San Cristobal de las Casas, in a colonial house that had belonged to our family for over 100 years. She was a small and quiet woman, with penetrating black eyes that seemed to see things others could not. My mother turned pale when I told her about the inheritance. Don't go to that house, Laura. Sell it without seeing it. There are things in that family that are better left buried. What things? You've never told me anything about great-grandmother Celestina. Because there is nothing good to tell. That woman practiced things. Witchcraft, sorcery. I don't know exactly. My grandmother warned me never to get too close to her. Please, Laura, just sell the house and forget about all this. But I was naturally curious, and the idea of having a property in San Cristobal, a beautiful tourist city, was too tempting to ignore. so during the summer vacation, I traveled to Chiapas to see my inheritance. The house was in the oldest neighborhood of the city, on a narrow cobblestone street surrounded by colonial buildings. It was 2 stories high, with thick adobe walls painted a faded yellow, and a central courtyard with a dry fountain covered in moss. The windows had wrought iron bars, and the front door was made of solid wood carved with symbols I did not recognize. The notary handed me the keys along with a sealed envelope. "Your great-grandmother left this for you. Specific instructions that it should only be opened after her death." I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in shaky handwriting. "Laura, if you are reading this, I have died and the house is now yours. But with the house comes a responsibility that our family has maintained for 5 generations. In the room on the 2nd floor, the one at the end of the hallway, you will find a sealed door. Behind that door is something that must remain closed. It is a burden, but also a protection. Never, under any circumstances, open that door. If you do, you will release something that I have kept contained for 70 years. If you decide not to accept this responsibility, sell the house. But make sure the new owner understands that door must never be opened. Your great-grandmother, Celestina." A chill ran through me as I read. What kind of thing needed to be kept sealed for 70 years? My natural skepticism suggested that my great-grandmother had simply been a superstitious woman, perhaps with mild mental issues in her old age. There was probably some sentimental object or embarrassing family document she wanted to keep hidden. I entered the house with my suitcase, determined to spend a few days assessing the property before deciding whether to sell it or keep it. The interior was surprisingly well preserved. The furniture was old but sturdy. There was electricity and running water, and although everything was covered in dust, the structure seemed to be in good condition. The 1st floor had a spacious living room, a dining room, a kitchen with a wood stove, and a small bathroom that had been added more recently. I climbed the wooden stairs that creaked under my weight. The 2nd floor had 3 rooms. The first 2 were regular bedrooms with old beds, wardrobes, and windows that faced the street. The 3rd room, at the end of the hallway, was different. The door was covered with symbols painted in red. I recognized some as Christian crosses, but others were strange. Circles with intersecting lines, complex geometric shapes, words in what seemed to be Latin, and over the entire surface of the door, someone had nailed dozens of small wooden crosses, forming a dense barrier. I tried to open the door, more out of curiosity than genuine intent. It was locked with 3 different padlocks, and the keys were not on the keyring that the notary had given me. Furthermore, someone had sealed the edges of the door with red wax, as if they wanted to ensure that not even air could enter or exit. My rational side said this was ridiculous. There were probably dead rats or toxic mold inside, and my great-grandmother, being superstitious, had dealt with the problem using rituals instead of professional exterminators. I decided that the next day I would call a locksmith to open the door, clean whatever was causing the problem, and then I could use that extra room to increase the value of the house. That night I slept in one of the unlocked rooms. The house made constant noises, like all old structures, creaking wood, whispers of wind through cracks, the occasional scratch of branches against the windows. I fell asleep listening to these sounds, finding them almost comforting in their normalcy. I woke up at 3 in the morning with the absolute certainty that I was not alone in the house. It wasn't a specific sound that woke me up. It was a sensation, a presence. The air in my room had become thick, hard to breathe. The temperature had dropped significantly, and my breath was visible in the air. I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, moving from the stairs toward the end of the corridor, toward the sealed door. I froze in bed, my heart pounding wildly. The footsteps stopped in front of the sealed door. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of someone trying to open the door from the inside. The doorknob was shaking violently. Something was banging against the wood from within, each thud louder than the last. The locks jingled, the wooden crosses vibrated, and a voice, low, raspy, pleading, "Let me out, please. I've been here so long. Let me out." I forced myself out of bed, trembling. I grabbed my cell phone, turned on the flashlight, and cautiously peeked into the hallway. It was empty. The footsteps had ceased. The knocking had stopped. The sealed door was exactly as I had left it, unchanged, but I could feel something behind it. A conscious presence, waiting, watching. I retreated to my room and spent the rest of the night with the lights on, the door locked, and my suitcase ready by the bed in case I needed to flee quickly. The next morning, with the daylight giving me false courage, I decided to investigate. If I was going to sell this house or keep it, I needed to know what was really going on. I searched the entire house for documents, diaries, anything that would explain the history of that sealed room. In the attic, I found an old metal box filled with papers. It contained family records dating back to 1890, letters, faded photographs, and a diary written by my great-grandmother. I sat on the dusty floor of the attic and began to read. The story that emerged from those yellowed pages was much darker than I had imagined. My great-grandmother Celestina had been a healer and midwife, following a family tradition that spanned generations, but she also practiced other arts, spiritual cleansings, protection rituals, and occasionally darker magic when requested and well paid. In 1952, when she was 28 years old, a wealthy woman named Dolores Espinosa hired her for a specific job. Dolores had discovered that her husband had a mistress and wanted revenge. Not the common kind of revenge, but something permanent, something that would completely destroy the husband and the mistress. Celestina, needing the money, agreed. She performed a forbidden ritual, one that invoked what she called in her diary, the hungry ones, entities that fed on human souls. The ritual required a sacrifice, something alive with innocent blood. Celestina sacrificed a newborn lamb, pouring its blood into an ancient silver mirror while reciting words in a language that was not Spanish. The hungry ones came. The diary pages described how the mirror had darkened, how twisted shapes had materialized on its surface, how they had promised to fulfill the revenge in exchange for a future payment. Dolores' husband and her lover died 3 days later under horrific circumstances. Their bodies were found completely drained of blood, with expressions of absolute terror frozen on their faces. The police investigation never found an explanation, but the hungry did not leave after fulfilling their part. They demanded more. They appeared in the mirror, whispering, demanding that Celestina bring them more souls, more blood. They tormented her day and night. Desperate, Celestina sought help from a priest who understood the occult. Together they performed a sealing ritual. They locked the mirror in that room on the second floor, covered the door with protective symbols, and sealed everything with blessings and prayers. The last entry in the diary, written just a month before her death, said, "I have kept them contained for 70 years, but I can feel the seal weakening. Soon someone will have to reinforce it, or break it completely and face the consequences. May God forgive my sins and protect whoever comes after me." I closed the diary with trembling hands. This couldn't be real. The hungry ones, demonic spirits trapped in a mirror, blood rituals. It was too fantastical to believe. But I had heard the knocks at the door. I had felt the presence, and I knew, on some deep and instinctive level, that my great-grandmother was not crazy. She had been protecting the family, the town, from something genuinely dangerous. I should have left the house at that moment. I should have sealed everything, never come back, maybe even burned the place to the ground. But part of me, the curious and rational part that couldn't accept the supernatural without direct evidence, needed to see. I hired a locksmith the next day. He was an older man from the village who looked at the sealed door with an uncomfortable expression. "Miss, this door was sealed for a reason. Doña Celestina was very specific about this. No one was to open it. She was my great-grandmother, and now this is my house. I just want to see what's inside." He shook his head but did his job. The 3 locks were removed one by one. He scraped the red wax from the edges. The small wooden crosses were carefully taken off and placed in a bag. "I won't go in with you," he said when he finished, "and I advise you not to do so either. But if you insist, at least wait until noon, with the sun high. Never open sealed doors in the dark." It was 11 in the morning. I paid him, and he left quickly, almost running out of the house. I waited until exactly noon, just as suggested. The sun streamed through the hallway windows, illuminating everything brightly. With a trembling hand, I turned the doorknob and pushed the door. It opened with a long, creaking groan. The air that came out was cold and stale, with a metallic smell that reminded me of old blood. The room was completely empty except for one thing, a full-length mirror in the center, covered with a black cloth. The mirror was antique, with an intricately wrought silver frame. Even covered, it emanated something that made me want to step back. The air around it seemed to vibrate slightly, like heat rising from asphalt in summer. I took a step into the room, then another. I approached the covered mirror, extending my hand toward the black cloth. At the moment my fingers touched the fabric, voices exploded in my head. Not one voice, but dozens, hundreds, all speaking simultaneously in different languages, some pleading, others threatening, others simply screaming without words. I ripped the fabric away in one pull. The mirror beneath did not reflect the room. Its surface was completely black, like a well of infinite darkness. And as I looked, that darkness began to move, swirling, forming patterns and shapes. I saw faces emerging from the darkness, human faces but distorted, stretching in agony, mouths open in silent screams, and behind them, larger, less human shapes, the hungry. They were difficult to describe because their form changed constantly. Sometimes they appeared to be masses of dark tentacles, other times, collections of eyes and mouths, but always hungry, always searching, always wanting. One of them pressed against the surface of the mirror from within. I saw its distorted shape pressing against what seemed to be an invisible glass, trying to break it, to cross into the real world. And then it spoke, not with sound but directly in my mind. "Liberator, you have broken the seal. Now we can come out. We can feed again." I recoiled, horrified. "No, I didn't break anything. The mirror still contains you. The seal of your ancestor weakened with her death. The prayers that kept it strong were silenced. Only the closed door kept us asleep. But now the door is open. We are awakening, and soon, when darkness falls, we will cross." I ran out of the room, stumbled down the stairs, and stepped into the bright street under the midday sun. My heart was pounding so hard that I thought I might faint. I wandered aimlessly through the streets of San Cristobal for hours, trying to process what I had seen, what I had heard. It wasn't my imagination. The hungry were real, and I had opened the door that kept them sealed. When the sun began to set, I knew I couldn't just run away. If what those things had said was true, if they were going to cross when darkness fell, I needed to do something. But what? I didn't know anything about rituals or sealing. I wasn't a healer or a witch like my great-grandmother. Desperate, I sought help. I discreetly asked in the village for someone who understood the occult, the spiritual. Several people directed me to a woman named Soledad, who lived on the outskirts of the city and had a reputation as a healer. I found her in a small house surrounded by gardens full of medicinal herbs. She was older, perhaps 60 years, with long braided gray hair and eyes that reminded me of my great-grandmother. I told her everything: the mirror, the hungry ones, what my great-grandmother had done 70 years ago. I expected her to think I was crazy, but instead, her expression grew serious. "I knew Doña Celestina," she said. "She taught me many things before she warned me never to follow in her footsteps in the darker arts. She knew about the mirror. All true healers in the region knew it. It was her burden, her penance for the mistake she made in her youth. Can you help me seal them again?" Soledad hesitated. "I can try." But the original sealing took the strength of Doña Celestina and a consecrated priest, working together for 3 days. And even then, they could only contain them, not destroy them. Without your great-grandmother alive to maintain the ritual. So what do? Do I let them out? Let them feed on whoever they find? No. There is another option. I can teach you to transfer the sealing, to take your great-grandmother's place as the guardian of the mirror. But it would mean you would have to stay here, in this house, keeping the prayers and protections active. It would be your life, your responsibility, just as it was for her. I looked at the darkening sky. I have no choice, do I? If I run away, they escape and kill innocent people. There is always a choice, Laura, but some options have consequences we cannot live with. We returned to the house together just as the sun was completely setting. I could feel the difference immediately. The air inside the house was charged, vibrating with a malevolent energy. The hungry were awake and active. We went up to the second floor. The door to the sealed room was wide open now, although I was sure I had closed it when I left. The mirror glowed with its own light, pulsing like a heart. The shapes within the mirror pressed against the surface more forcefully now. Fine cracks began to appear in the glass. We didn't have much time. Soledad worked quickly, drawing symbols on the ground with blessed chalk, lighting candles, burning herbs that filled the room with acrid smoke. She instructed me to kneel in the center of a circle she had traced. "The transfer ritual requires you to willingly accept the burden," she explained. "You must promise to maintain the seal, Perform daily prayers, never abandon your post. It is a binding oath, not only with humans but with spiritual forces. Do you understand? I understand. And do you accept? I thought of my life in Mexico City, my job as a teacher, my friends, my apartment, my freedom. All of that would have to end if I accepted this. I would be bound to this house, to this town, keeping a constant vigil over a cursed mirror. But if I refused, people would die. The hungry would feed. And it would all be my fault for having opened that door. I accept, I said. Soledad began to sing in a mix of Spanish, Latin, and what sounded like an ancient indigenous language. She made me repeat words I didn't fully understand. The smoke from the herbs swirled around us in patterns that did not follow the normal flow of air. The mirror reacted violently. The cracks on its surface expanded. The hungry inside roared, pounded, tried to break free completely before the ritual was completed. I felt something changing within me, a connection forming, invisible but undeniable, between my soul and the mirror. It was as if it had taken root in this place, permanently binding me to the ground beneath the house. The final words of the ritual left my mouth, and a wave of energy exploded from the circle. The cracks in the mirror closed instantly. The pulsing light dimmed. The hungry inside recoiled, pushed back into the depths of the mirror, sealed once again. The silence that followed was absolute. Loneliness stopped singing. The smoke began to dissipate, and I remained kneeling in the circle, feeling the weight of what I had just accepted. It is done, Soledad said softly. You are the guardian now. The mirror is sealed again, but the seal must be reinforced every day with prayers. I will teach you the words, and you can never ever abandon this vigilance. If you do, they will escape immediately. That was a year ago. I quit my job in Mexico City, sold my apartment, and moved permanently to San Cristobal de las Casas. I got a job teaching at a local school, but my true job is another. Every morning and every night, I go up to the second floor, enter that room, and recite the sealing prayers. I burn the specific herbs. I renew the protection symbols. I keep the hungry contained. Sometimes I hear them whispering from the mirror, trying to tempt me, persuading me to release them. They promise power, knowledge, riches. Other times they threaten, describing the horrible things they will do to me if I ever let my guard down. I ignore them. I have learned to live with their constant presence, just as my great-grandmother did for 70 years. My family thinks I'm crazy for moving here. My mother won't talk to me, furious that I didn't heed her warning. My friends from the city stopped inviting me to visit when it became clear that I couldn't leave even for a weekend. But I have found a new life here. The children I teach love me. Solitude has become my mentor and friend, teaching me more about traditional healing arts. And there is a strange peace in knowing exactly what my purpose is, why I am here. I am the guardian of the mirror. I keep the hungry contained. I protect the world from the mistakes made by my great-grandmother decades ago. It's a life I never chose, but it's the life I now have. And I will carry it until my last breath, hoping that whoever comes after me is as strong as I needed to be. Thus concludes the story that Laura sent me. She told me that writing this was part of her process of accepting her new reality. She still lives in San Cristobal, still maintains her daily vigilance. If you have ever inherited something that came with responsibilities you never expected, share it in the comments. Sometimes family legacies include burdens we never asked to carry. Sweet dreams, and see you next time. This story was sent to me by a listener who identifies himself as Andres, an on-call doctor in a public hospital in a medium-sized city. He wrote to me that he is not someone who believes in supernatural things, that his training and work have taught him to seek rational explanations for everything, and that precisely because of this, what he experienced during a night shift 2 years ago disturbed him in a way that he still hasn't fully resolved. If you have an experience you've kept to yourself that you never knew how to tell, write to me. Sometimes the right place for certain stories is not everyday conversation, but a space like this, where no one will judge you. Now, allow me to tell you what happened to Andres on the hospital ward during the 3 o'clock shift with a patient who hadn't spoken for 3 weeks. I have been working in emergency and hospitalization for 12 years. I have seen people die. I have seen individuals in the most extreme moments of their lives. with fear on their faces and their bodies failing, and their consciousness clinging to whatever it can. I have learned to process that in the way doctors do, with a functional distance that is not coldness but professional survival, the ability to compartmentalize what you see in order to remain useful. I share this to make it clear from the beginning that I am not someone who is easily frightened. I am not someone who interprets the creaks of an old building as something supernatural, nor do I see meaning in coincidences. I am, or was, a deeply skeptical person about everything that lacks verifiable explanation. What happened that night on the 4th floor has no verifiable explanation, and I have spent 2 years trying to find it. The hospital where I work has 5 floors for hospitalization and emergency services on the ground floor. The 4th floor is for internal medicine, where cases that require prolonged observation but are not in critical condition are admitted. It is a quiet floor compared to the emergency room or the ICU. The patients are usually elderly people with decompensated chronic conditions who stay there for days or weeks while they stabilize. On that floor, there was a patient who had been admitted for 3 weeks when what I am about to recount happened. His name was Mr. Aurelio. He was 84 years old, and he had been admitted for pneumonia that had evolved complicatedly in a man of his age and with his medical history. Physically, he was responding to treatment. The markers were improving week by week, and everything indicated that in a couple of weeks he could be discharged. The problem was that Mr. Aurelio did not speak, not because he couldn't. His vocal cords were functioning, his airways were clear, his level of consciousness was adequate. He simply did not speak. He looked at those who entered his room with complete and quiet attention, responded to basic instructions, allowed himself to be examined without resistance, but did not utter a single word. Psychiatry had evaluated him, the neurologist had too. There was no identifiable injury, no diagnosable dementia. The provisional conclusion was reactive mutism, likely related to the stress of prolonged hospitalization in an elderly person. His family, a daughter and a son-in-law who came to visit him every afternoon, said that he had always been a man of few words, but that this was different. That since he was admitted, there was something in him that they did not recognize. That sometimes when they arrived for a visit, they found him staring at the corner of the room, the corner that was in front of his bed, with a fixation that made them uncomfortable. I had attended to Mr. Aurelio during several shifts. He was an easy patient in a practical sense. He didn't cause problems, and he didn't need much active attention beyond routine monitoring. But there was something about him that also made me uncomfortable, although I had never analyzed it too much until that night. It was the way he looked at that corner. The Wednesday shift started normally. I received the afternoon report, reviewed the patients who needed priority attention, and made rounds on the floors. Mr. Aurelio was stable. He ate what was served to him, which was already an improvement from previous weeks. When I entered his room around 10 o'clock at night for the night check, he looked at me with his calm and still attention. The corner in front of his bed was empty, as always, but he wasn't looking at it that night. He was looking at me. I noted his vital signs, asked him if he was in pain, received silence as the usual response, and left. At 1 in the morning, I received a call from the 4th floor. The on-duty nurse named Pilar, who had been at that hospital longer than I had, called me with a voice that was not of medical urgency but of something else that I couldn't classify immediately. "Dr. Andres, can you come to room 42? Room 42 was Don Aurelio's room. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Has he gotten worse?" "No," Pilar said. "He is talking." It took me a second to process that. "He is talking?" "Yes." A brief pause. "Please come." I went up to the 4th floor. The hallway was in that specific calm of hospitals in the early morning. The lighting dimmed. The distant sound of some monitor. The smell of disinfectant that one stops noticing after years. But that night I perceived with a strange clarity. Pilar was waiting for me outside room 42. She was a woman in her 50s, with that accumulated experience of someone who has seen practically everything in a hospital and is no longer easily unsettled. But that night she had an expression I had never seen before. "How long has he been talking?" I asked quietly. "For about 20 minutes, Pilar said, also quietly. It caught my attention because I heard the voice from the hallway and thought someone had come in to visit him, that it was a voice I didn't recognize. I went in, and he was alone. "What is he saying?" Pilar looked at me. "That's what I want you to hear." she said. I gently pushed the door and entered. The room was dimly lit, with only the soft light from the bedside lamp on. Don Aurelio was sitting up in bed, his eyes open, staring directly at the corner across the room, that corner his family had mentioned. And he was speaking. It was a low, continuous voice, with the rhythm of someone having a conversation. Not a monologue. A conversation, with pauses between phrases, as if he were listening to responses that I couldn't hear. The voice was calm, without agitation, without signs of distress. But there was something in it that made the hairs on my arms stand on end before my brain processed why. It was not Don Aurelio's voice. Oh, it wasn't exactly his voice. It was deeper. It had a different cadence, something older in tone, as if the words were coming from a place deeper than the throat. I attributed it in that first moment to the illness, to the effects of weeks of previous intubation, to any medical explanation that could accommodate what I was hearing. I approached. I stood next to his bed. Don Aurelio did not look at me. His eyes remained fixed on the corner. I listened to what he was saying. Most of it was difficult to understand, words in a low voice overlapping each other. But I caught fragments, and what I caught stuck with me with a precision that still feels strange, because at that moment I was not in a position to take notes, but the words settled in my memory with a clarity that did not correspond to the circumstances. He said, "I know it's time." And then, after a pause, "Not yet." And then, "There is someone who shouldn't hear this." At that moment, his eyes moved from the corner to me. He looked directly at me, with that still and complete attention of his. And for the first time in 3 weeks of guard duty, Don Aurelio spoke to me. "Doctor," he said with that voice that was not quite his voice, "do you believe in what cannot be seen?" It took me a second to respond. "I am a doctor. I am trained to maintain composure in stressful situations." "Don Aurelio," I said with my voice as calm as I could, "I'm glad you are speaking. How do you feel? You?" He did not answer my question. He kept looking at me. "There are things that stay in places," he said, "like the smell of tobacco in a room where someone smoked for years. You can't see it, but it's there. Do you understand?" "I understand what you're telling me," I said. "No," he said, and in that denial there was something that was not correction, but something more like the calm certainty of someone who knows exactly what they are talking about. "You understand the words, not what is behind the words." He leaned back against the pillow again. His eyes returned to the corner, and the conversation that I could not hear continued. I left the room. Pilar was in the hallway. "Had anything like this ever happened before?" I asked her. She took a moment. "In that room," she said, "about 7 years ago a patient died who had been admitted for several weeks. He was also an older man. He also spent the last week talking to something that no one else could see or hear." She paused. "Back then, I thought it was the medication, or the terminal state, or just what happens to people when they are very close to the end. And now?" I said. Pilar looked at me with that expression of hers that was not exactly fear, but something more reflective. "Now I think that maybe there are things that happen in certain places and that certain people can perceive and others cannot," she said, "and that Don Aurelio is one of those who can." I returned to the room 3 more times that night. On each occasion, Don Aurelio was in the same position, with his eyes in the corner, speaking in a low voice. On the second visit, his vital signs were perfectly normal. On the third, around 4 in the morning, he fell silent, closed his eyes, and fell asleep with the placidity of someone who has finished a long and satisfying conversation. I stood at the door of his room for a moment, looking at that empty corner to which he had dedicated so many hours of attention, and tried to feel something, anything, any variation in temperature or air pressure, or any measurable parameter that would give me a rational anchor to what I had witnessed. I felt nothing. The corner was just a corner. White walls, linoleum floor, the leg of a visitor's chair. With nothing visible, no anomalies detected. Nothing that my medical training or common sense could point to as the source of what had happened that night. I closed the door and went to write the shift notes. The next morning, when day shift arrived, I informed the attending physician about Mr. Aurelio that the patient had spoken during the night. She noted it with clinical interest, went to see him, and called me a little while later with something in her voice that was not exactly surprise, but something more akin to controlled perplexity. Mr. Aurelio had spoken to her. Not much, not extensively, but he had answered her questions briefly and clearly. He had told her that he felt well. He had asked her when he could go home. The physician interpreted it as a spontaneous resolution of the mutism, which was not unusual in these types of cases. She called psychiatry for a re-evaluation. She called the family to inform them of the change. Everyone was happy. I should have been too. The patient was improving. It was the expected outcome. But that afternoon, before going home to sleep after my shift, I went up to the 4th floor once more. The door to room 42 was open. Don Aurelio was sitting on the bed, looking out the window, with the afternoon light coming in at an angle. His daughter had come to visit and was sitting beside him, holding his hand, with that expression of relief of someone who has regained something they feared they had lost. I peeked into the doorway. Don Aurelio saw me, and he said something I didn't expect. "Doctor." His voice was now more recognizable, more his own, with that raspy tone of men his age who have smoked for a long time. "Thank you for staying last night." "It's my job," I said. He shook his head very slowly. "Not for that," he said. "For not leaving when you should have." A pause. "There are things that are better if someone is present. Someone who is not afraid." His daughter was looking at us, not entirely understanding the exchange. I didn't fully understand it either, but I nodded. And Don Aurelio looked out the window again. She was discharged 2 weeks later. She walked out, with her daughter on one side and her son-in-law on the other, with that quiet dignity of the elderly who have decided that what time they have left will be lived on their own terms. As she passed by the nursing station, she saw me and stopped for a moment. "Take care," she told me simply, and she left. Pilar and I looked at each other when she disappeared down the hallway toward the elevators. "Did she ever ask you who she was talking to?" Pilar asked me. "Not directly," I said. "I did," she said. "The morning after that night, I asked her, just like that, who she had been talking to." She paused. She looked at me for a moment and said, "Someone who needed to be heard, and who had been waiting a long time for someone to do it." I processed that in silence. "And what do you think?" I asked her. Pilar picked up some papers from the control desk and organized them with that efficiency of hers, as someone who always has something to do. "I think," he said, "that there are people who can do things that others cannot, that there are places where those things are easier, and that sometimes what seems like an illness is something completely different." He looked at me, and I think that room is now quieter than before Don Aurelio arrived, and that whatever it means seems good to me. 2 years have passed since that night. I have continued working in the same hospital, on the same 4th floor, and I have entered room 42 hundreds of times since then. It is a room like the others, with its white walls and linoleum floor and its window overlooking the parking lot. The corner in front of the bed is just a corner, but there is something that changed in me that night and has not returned to its previous state, and it is the way I listen to patients who speak of things I cannot see. It's not that I now blindly believe in the supernatural. I am still a doctor. I still look for medical explanations first. I still apply the protocol. But there is something in my attitude that opened a millimeter that night and has not completely closed. A willingness to consider that perhaps not everything that happens in hospital rooms at dawn has an explanation that fits in a medical manual. And sometimes, when I do the night round and pass by 42 with the door ajar and the room in shadow, I pause for a moment in the hallway, listening. The silence inside is different from that of the other rooms. I don't know if that means anything, but I no longer ignore it. And that's all Andres told me. This is the testimony of Andres. He wrote to me at the end that Don Aurelio passed away a few months after being discharged, at home, surrounded by his family, calmly according to what his daughter told him in a message she sent to inform him. I thought it was important to include that. There is something in this story that has to do with listening, with what happens when someone finally pays attention to what others cannot or do not want to see. If you work in a hospital or anywhere you are close to people in critical moments and have experienced something you didn't know how to explain, I would like to know. Leave it in the comments. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, consider doing so. There are more stories like this waiting. Sleep well tonight. We'll talk soon. listener who signs as Elena wrote to me from Venezuela a few days ago. She told me that what she is about to share happened to her when she was 35 years old, during a week she spent alone in her recently deceased grandmother's house, sorting through her things. She had never believed in any of this, until that week. If you have an experience with a family member who has passed away and somehow remained present, share it with me below. Now, this is what Elena found among her grandmother's belongings. My grandmother Petra died on a Tuesday in February. She was 83 years old and died as she had lived, on her own terms, in her own bed, without hospitals or machines prolonging something she had already decided to let go of. The last time I visited her, 2 weeks before her death, she took my hand with a strength that did not correspond to someone in that condition, and looked at me with those eyes of hers that always seemed to know something the rest of us did not. "Elena," she told me, "when I leave, go to the house before anyone else. Before your mother, before your uncles. You first." "Why?" I asked her. "Because there are things that are for you," she said, "and there are things that are for no one. You have to know how to distinguish which are which." I asked her what she meant. "You will understand when you arrive," she said, and she closed her eyes. Those were the last words she spoke directly to me. She died 9 days later, while sleeping, without pain according to those who were present. I am the eldest granddaughter. I was 35 years old then, working as an accountant in a medium-sized company, living alone in an apartment that was exactly the right size for a person who prefers order and silence. I was skeptical by nature, the kind that needs to see to believe, and that when she sees first looks for an explanation before accepting anything else. That was me before that week. My grandmother Petra's house was in an old neighborhood of the city, a house like those from before, with a tiled roof and thick walls, and an interior patio with a lemon tree that she tended to with almost ceremonial dedication. She had lived there alone for the last 12 years, since my grandfather died. The family visited her regularly, but no one lived with her because she did not allow it. I arrived 2 days after her death, just as she had asked me, before my mother and uncles who were organizing the arrangements from another city. I had had the keys for years. I entered alone. The smell of the house was the same as always. Lavender, coffee, old wood, something sweet that I had never been able to identify precisely, but that I completely associated with her. Everything was tidy as always because my grandmother Petra was a woman who did not leave things out of their place. The cups lined up in the kitchen, the books on their shelves, the pictures straight on the walls. There was only one thing different. In the center of the dining table, perfectly centered on the embroidered tablecloth that my grandmother used for special occasions, there was a notebook. It was old, with a black cardboard cover, worn corners, and a spine reinforced with yellowing tape from age. My grandmother had left it there on purpose, that was evident. She had placed it there for me to find. I sat in my usual chair, the one facing the patio window, and opened it. My grandmother's handwriting filled the pages from the first to the last. A handwriting I would recognize among thousands, round and precise, with that characteristic slant of people who learned to write when it was taught as a skill to be perfected. It wasn't exactly a diary. It was more like a record. Dates spanning decades, some entries very short with just a few lines, others occupying several pages. The tone was that of someone documenting, not of someone confessing. Concrete, without drama, like a report of things that happened and that deserved to be written down. I read for hours. What I found in that notebook was the story of a life I thought I knew, which turned out to be considerably more complex than any granddaughter could imagine. My grandmother Petra had had since she was young, a capacity that she described in the notebook with an almost technical neutrality. She could see things that others did not see, not exactly ghosts, at least not in the sense of human figures. She described them as presences, densities in space, accumulations of something that did not have a precise name, but that she had learned to recognize and distinguish from one another, like one learns to distinguish smells. He had spent most of his life learning to live with that, not to be frightened, to establish a functional distance between what he saw and what affected him. There were people in his life who knew about this ability and whom he turned to when he needed guidance. There were situations he had managed, things he had kept away from his family without anyone knowing, protections he had maintained active for decades. Some entries were about my mother when she was a child, about my uncles, about us, the grandchildren. There were several about me. The first era was when I was 6 years old. She described something she had noticed in me, an undeveloped ability, a potential she recognized because she had it herself. She wrote with a mix of satisfaction and concern that I understood perfectly. The satisfaction of recognizing something familiar, the concern of knowing what it implies. The entries about me continued over the years. Observations of things I did or said that went unnoticed by others, but that she noticed attentively. Moments when I had reacted to something without knowing exactly what. The time when, at 12 years old, I refused to go into the basement of a relative's house without being able to explain why. And she simply wrote in her notebook, "Elena felt it. She doesn't know what she felt, but she felt it. Good." I reached the last pages when it had already darkened outside and I had completely forgotten to turn on the lights in the house. I was reading with the natural light from the patio that filtered through the window, increasingly dim. The last entries were recent, from the last few months, written in a handwriting that seemed more strained, as if the hand struggled more than before, but the will to write was equally strong. The last entry was from 3 weeks before her death, 1 week before my last visit. It said, "There is something in the house that has been here for a long time and that I have kept still. It's not exactly bad, but it's not neutral either. It's something that remained from those who lived here before us, something that anchored itself to this place before I arrived. For decades, I learned to coexist with it and to ensure that it didn't expand outward. But I am leaving. And when I go, there will be no one to contain it anymore. Elena has what it takes to handle it, even though she doesn't know it yet. I am going to leave her instructions. She will know what to do." Underneath, there was a folded page, clipped to the inside of the back cover, that I hadn't seen until that moment. I peeled it off and opened it. There were instructions, written in the same precise handwriting, organized in numbered steps. What I was supposed to look for, what I was supposed to do with what I found. The words I was supposed to say, written phonetically with a note that said, "Don't ask where these words come from, just say the exact ones." At the end of the instructions, a brief note, "Don't be afraid. Fear is the only possible mistake. What is in this house will recognize you just as I recognized you. That is an advantage, not a danger. Use it." I sat in the darkness of the dining room for a time I did not measure. A part of me, the counting part, the skeptical part of 35 years with no experience that contradicted its worldview, wanted to fold that page, put the notebook in a box, and call my mother to tell her what I had found. Another part of me, an older and harder to name part, already knew I was going to follow the instructions. I started that very night. The first thing I had to do, according to my grandmother Petra's instructions, was to walk through each room of the house with the lights off and simply pay attention, not to look for anything, not to expect anything specific, just to pay attention. I walked through the house in the dark, the living room, the kitchen, the bathroom, the guest room where I slept when I came to visit her, my grandmother's bedroom, which smelled more intensely of lavender and her than any other space, and where I paused a moment longer than expected, processing the absence. And then the room at the end of the hall, the one that had always been locked, the one I had never seen open in all the years I had been visiting that house. The one that, when I was a child, I asked my grandmother what was inside. She simply replied, "Things you don't need to see yet." The key was in the notebook, inside a small envelope glued to the first page that I had felt when I opened it but had not yet explored. I opened the room. Inside there was a small room, completely empty of furniture, with walls painted a white that had acquired a yellowish tone over the years. In the center of the floor, there was a circle drawn with something that looked like salt, perfectly intact. Inside the circle, a small object, a dark green stone, almost black, the size of my fist, with an irregular shape that did not correspond to any natural stone I knew. It had markings on the surface that could have been natural erosion or could have been deliberately engraved. The temperature in that room was noticeably lower than in the rest of the house. And there was something else, a presence, which is the only word I can use, although I know it is not precise, that I felt in a way that was none of the 5 conventional senses but was absolutely real. Like the awareness that there is someone in the room before you see them, only denser, older. I remembered what my grandmother had written. "He will recognize you." I stood at the threshold and let him recognize me. I don't know how long I was like that. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 20. At some point, the presence changed. It didn't disappear, but something in it settled, like when someone who was standing sits down, a relaxation of something that had been tense. I followed the instructions. What I did in that room during the next hour, I will recount only in general terms, not because I want to be mysterious, but because there are parts of my grandmother's instructions that she herself wrote that should not be repeated aloud or in writing. I took that seriously. The instructions involved the stone, the circle of salt, the words she had written phonetically, and an object that I had brought without knowing I would bring it, because the instructions said that I would have something of mine with me that would serve the purpose and that I would recognize what it was when the time came. I recognized what it was. It was a necklace that my grandmother had given me years ago, which I always wore without knowing exactly why, which I had never been able to leave at home even though sometimes it felt uncomfortable or out of place with certain clothes. Everything I'm going to say about what happened when I followed the last steps of the instructions is this. There was a moment when the temperature in the room dropped even further, to the point where I could see the steam from my own breath, and at that moment, the presence concentrated in a way that I can't describe except to say that it was as if all the space in the room compressed towards a point, and then it expanded, quickly, like an exhalation. And after that, the room was at the same temperature as the rest of the house, and the presence was no longer there. I sat on the floor in the middle of the broken salt circle, with the necklace in my hand, and stayed there for a long time doing nothing. When I went out, I picked up the stone with a cloth as the instructions indicated, without touching it directly, and took it to the yard. I dug a hole next to the lemon bush, which is where the instructions said I should bury it. My grandmother had written, "The lemon tree is the most honest tree in the garden. What is buried beneath it remains neutral." I buried the stone. I went back inside, washed my hands, turned on the lights, and made myself a coffee. That night I slept in the guest room and slept well, with that quiet depth that sleep has when the body has used energies it didn't know it had. The following days I spent organizing the house as I had promised, sorting out my grandmother's things for the family. My mother and my uncles arrived on the third day. None of them noticed anything different in the house. None asked about the room at the end of the hallway, which I had locked again. I didn't tell them anything. Not because I wanted to keep the secret indefinitely, but because at that moment I didn't have the words to tell it in a way that didn't sound like delirium, and because I had kept my grandmother's notebook in my bag and felt that it was mine before it belonged to anyone else. It still is. I have it at home, in a drawer that I don't open frequently, but that I know is there. I have reread certain parts many times. The entries about me, especially those that describe things she noticed in me that I never noticed in myself. And yet upon reading them, I recognize, like when someone describes a trait of yours that has always been there, but for which you never had a name. Has anything changed since that week? Yes, not dramatically. I don't wake up seeing apparitions or hearing voices, but there is something that works differently in me now, an awareness that I didn't have before or that I had without knowing how to use it. I enter a place and know things about it that I shouldn't know through any conventional means. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. Most of the time, over time, it has seemed useful to me. My grandmother Petra knew what she was doing when she chose me. I have no doubt about that. And I have no doubts about the week in that house, about what I felt in that room, about the temperature that dropped and the presence that left, about the stone that is buried under the lemon tree in the yard of a house that now belongs to the family and that no one is going to unearth because no one knows it is there, except for me, and now, you. That is all Elena wanted to share. She told me it took her a long time to decide to send it, that she didn't know how it would sound written down. To me, it sounds exactly as it should, like something true. If a senior family member ever left you something, an object, a letter, a warning that you didn't fully understand at the time, I would love to read it in the comments. And if this story found you tonight while you were resting, consider subscribing to keep receiving more. Until the next story, take care. I received this message from a listener named Sofia from Spain. She wrote to me that what she is going to tell happened to her 7 years ago, that she has told very few people, and that most of them did not believe her. Before I start, if you have something similar stored away and want me to narrate it, write to me. Reading those messages is what makes this channel possible. Now let me tell you what happened to Sophia the night her little daughter started talking to someone who didn't exist. My daughter Lucia was 4 years old when she started talking to the boy in the corner. That's what she called him, with that disarming naturalness that small children have to say things that paralyze adults. Lucia mentioned him one night during dinner, without preamble, while eating her soup. The boy in the corner says he doesn't like it when you turn off the light. My husband Ernesto and I looked at each other across the table. "What boy, dear?" I asked her. I asked. "The one in the corner of my room," she said, as if it were obvious. "The one that is there at night." Ernesto and I were one of those couples that read about child development. We knew that imaginary friends are completely normal in children of that age, that the developing brain builds companions and relationships that serve real psychological functions. We were not alarmed. We went along with it with the calmness of informed parents. "And what is the boy like?" Ernesto asked. Lucia thought for a moment. "Sad," she said. "He is always sad. We lived in an apartment in a medium-sized city in northern Spain. Ernesto worked as an engineer in a construction company, and I had been on leave for 4 years taking care of Lucia, intending to return to work in accounting when she started school. It was an orderly and quiet life. We had had the apartment for 2 years, having bought it second-hand from a family that was moving to another city, and we had never had any problems with it." The boy in the corner became part of the conversational landscape for Lucia during the following weeks. She mentioned him frequently, always in a sideways manner, as if referring to something she took for granted, that the boy had been there when she woke up at night, that the boy had told her he was cold, that the boy sometimes cried but very softly, so as not to disturb. Ernesto remained completely calm about it. I was too, on the surface. But there is something in certain things that small children say that settles in a mother's mind with a persistence that rationality cannot completely dislodge. I began to pay more attention to Lucia's room. It was a normal room, pale pink on the walls, which we had painted before she was born, a bed with railings, a white wardrobe, a shelf with books and toys. The window overlooked an inner courtyard that had little light, but was not gloomy either. The corner that Lucia referred to was the one between the wardrobe wall and the window wall, the darkest part of the room when the light was turned off, a completely empty corner. One night, when Lucia was already asleep, I stood in the doorway of her room looking at that corner for a long moment. The only light was from the hallway, which came in sideways and created elongated shadows on the walls. There was nothing. Of course, there was nothing. I went to bed and tried not to think about it anymore. The real change happened on a Saturday afternoon, about 3 weeks after the first mention of the child. Lucia was playing in her room. I was in the living room folding clothes, with the door to Lucia's room open and the living room door also open, so I could hear her. It was a familiar and comforting sound, the murmur of a 4-year-old girl playing alone, talking to herself or to her toys with that particular narrative logic that young children's games have. Then I heard Lucia stop talking. The silence was sudden. One of those silences that have weight because they replace something that was there a moment before. I stood still with a half-folded t-shirt in my hands, listening. Then I heard Lucia's voice again, but different. It wasn't the voice of play. It was lower, more serious. The tone she uses when she talks to adults or when she says something she considers important. "Why can't you leave?" Lucia said. Silence. "What did you lose?" Silence. "Where did you leave it?" I got up from the couch and walked towards Lucia's room. When I reached the door, she was standing in the center of the room, looking at the corner, her hands at her sides, her head slightly tilted, with that expression of concentration she had when she was listening to something attentively. "Lucia," I said. She turned towards me. Her expression was completely normal. "Mom, the boy says he lost something and that he can't leave until he finds it." I knelt in front of her. "What did he lose?" Lucia frowned as if consulting internally. "He doesn't know how to call it," she said. "He says it's something of his, something that belonged to him and that someone took away." That night, when Lucia was sleeping and Ernesto and I were in bed, I told him about the conversation. Ernesto listened with that calmness of his that sometimes reassures me and other times drives me crazy. "Children build very elaborate narratives," he said. "They probably heard something, some story, some conversation, and they are processing it through the imaginary friend. What conversation about a child who lost something and can't leave? It doesn't have to be literal, he said. Children reinterpret. Ernesto, she was standing looking at the corner and asking questions to the void. Children do that all the time. He was technically right. Children do that all the time. But I was there and saw Lucia's face, and there was something in that concentration, in that seriousness with which she listened to the silence of the corner, that didn't feel like a little girl's game with an imaginary friend. It felt like a real conversation. I started to investigate the floor, not dramatically, just with the cautious curiosity of someone who wants to be at peace and knows that the only way to achieve that is to have information. I went to the property registry and looked up the history of the property. The apartment had had 3 previous owners in the last 40 years. The family that sold it to us had owned it for 10 years, before them another family for 15, and before that the original owners, who had it from the construction of the building in the 80s until the early 2000s. Nothing unusual in the registry. I searched the local newspaper's archive, which had a digital version with a search function. It took me a while to find something, but I found it. A brief note from almost 30 years ago. A 6-year-old boy had died in the building. The official cause was a domestic accident. No further details were given, as was customary at that time with news involving minors. The name of the building matched ours. It didn't specify the floor number. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I searched for the name of the family that had lived in the apartment before the ones who sold it to us. It took longer, but I found something. An obituary from several years later, the death of an elderly woman. In the list of survivors, there was a son with a name, and in that woman's biographical note, a line that said she had lost a young son in a tragic accident. It couldn't be proven that it happened in our apartment, but it couldn't be ruled out either. That night I couldn't sleep. The next day I took Lucia to the park, and while she played with other children in the sandbox, I sat on a bench and allowed myself to think about what could be true if I accepted the premise that my daughter seemed to have accepted without difficulty, that there was a child in the corner of her room, a child who could not leave because he had lost something. If there was a child who died in that apartment 30 years ago, what could he have lost? The answer came obliquely, as answers sometimes do when they are not sought directly. It was Lucia who gave it to me that same afternoon while I was bathing her. "Mom, the boy says that what he lost is inside a box." I stopped with the shampoo in my hand. "What box?" "A small box, blue, with a lid that has a drawing of a boat." "And where is the box?" Lucia thought. "He says it was in his room, that someone put it away for him." That night I searched the upstairs thoroughly. I didn't find any blue box with a boat. I looked in all the closets, under the furniture, in the pantry, in the storage room. Nothing. But then I thought of something. When we bought the apartment, the previous family had left some things in the building storage room, in the basement, with the promise of picking them up in a few weeks. Those things were never picked up. We had assumed they had forgotten about them or no longer wanted them, and we had left them there untouched because the storage room was large and we didn't need the space. I went down to the basement. It was a long and dimly lit space, with the characteristic dampness of old building basements. The belongings of the previous family were at the back, against the wall, under a plastic tarp. Cardboard boxes, bags, some small furniture stacked up. I started to go through the boxes. In the third box I opened among folded children's clothes that were clearly not recent. I found a small wooden box, blue, with a lid on which a ship was painted, the paint already chipped away by time. I stood still holding it. It was small, the size of a children's shoebox. The blue paint was that bright blue used for children's things, now worn and dull. The ship on the lid was a simple silhouette, probably painted by an adult hand with craft paint. I opened it. Inside there were childhood things, a small rusty toy car, a glass marble with a blue spiral in the center, a folded photograph, and a pencil drawing on graph paper, the kind of paper that children use in school, with the clumsy and endearing figure that 6 or 7-year-olds draw. A house, 2 big people, 1 small in the center. I unfolded the photograph. It was a family photo. A man, a woman, and a boy about 6 years old sitting between them. The boy looked at the camera with a smile that had the chaotic energy of children at that age. I lifted the box to the floor. I entered Lucia's room. She was playing on the floor with her dolls. I placed the box in the center of the room, in front of the corner. Lucia looked at it. Then she looked at the corner, and something passed over her face that I couldn't precisely describe but recognized. Relief. "Is that the box?" I asked her. Lucia nodded. "It says yes." "And can it go now?" Lucia listened to the silence of the corner for a moment. "She says yes," she repeated. "But thank you." That night, for the first time in weeks, Lucia slept without waking up, and the next day, when I asked her about the boy in the corner, she looked at me with that slightly confused expression that children have when they don't quite understand what you mean. "What boy?" she said. She never mentioned it again. I put the box away. I didn't know what to do with it for a while. I thought about looking for the adult children of the family that sold us the apartment. The ones who, according to the obituary I had found, had lost a younger brother decades ago, and returning it to them. But I couldn't find a way to contact them, and at some point, I decided that maybe it was better for the box to stay in the apartment. That if there was something of that boy that belonged to that place, perhaps it was better for it to stay there. The blue box with the boat is now in the closet of my room, on the highest shelf. I have opened it twice since then, just to check that it's still there, and that everything is still inside. The rusty cart, the marble, the photograph, the drawing. Lucia is now 11 years old and doesn't remember any of this. I asked her once carefully when she was about 8. She looked at me with the expression of someone searching for a memory they can't find. "I don't remember," she said. "Sometimes I also wish I could forget, but that's not how it works." That was all Sophia wanted to share. She told me that writing it down cost her more than she expected, that there are things that seem more real when put into words. If a small child ever told you something you couldn't explain, or if you experienced something similar in your own home, tell me in the comments. I'm interested in reading it. And if this story accompanied you while you rested, subscribe to keep receiving more. Take care. We'll talk soon.